Okay, so again, welcome all of you. My name is Connie Ruggeband from the University of Amsterdam. Today we have this discussion on neoliberal fuel to anti-feminism. And it's great that you are all joining it. It's going to be an informal discussion, and I will first introduce the speakers and then tell you a little bit about the format of today. So we are interested, this is a seminar that's part of the Gender Sexuality in European Geopolitics series, but today we will be discussing again neoliberalism's fuel to anti-feminism, and with three specific guests, which I will introduce in a minute, because they will be discussing with you how neoliberal policies and politics have changed the opportunity structures for feminist movements and class and race inclusive activism. So as we all know, anti-feminism has been on the rise over the last decade, and many scholars have linked it to the global financial crisis, to austerity measures, to neoliberal policies. So today we will be exploring these links, but we will also be looking at feminist responses to this across Europe, which often have been quite fierce and strong. So we want this to be an open and formal discussion with the public. This means that you can ask questions, and you can do this either through the chat if you prefer. You can put in the chat that you have a question that you want to pose yourself, and then we will pass on the word to you. The discussion will be moderated by Amber Senklusem, Naomi Loers, and Julia Paileko, three MA students from the University of Amsterdam who've worked on these issues with me and who've prepared some initial questions. But again, we keep an eye on yours too. And I'm very happy and proud to have three great speakers for today who are very knowledgeable about the topic. So I want to introduce first Akwugo Emejulu. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick, and she's written extensively about Black feminism in Europe, about race in academia, about social movements. And particularly for today's discussion, her 2017 book with Lea Bassel, Minority Women and Austerity, Survival, Resistance in France and Britain, is particularly relevant. And also, I think before she entered academia, she worked in a variety of grassroots roles, which I think will probably also inform her view on this. So as a community organizer, trade union organizer. So it's wonderful to have you, Akwugo, so welcome. Elzbieta Korolczuk is the second speaker. She's a sociologist working at Södertörn University of Sweden, but she also teaches gender studies at Warsaw University and the Institute for Advanced Study in Warsaw. She's written, her research is on social movements, civil society, and gender. And she's published extensively on these topics in the region of Central Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland. And I think, particularly for today's discussion, she has written a number of relevant pieces in social politics and science about feminism, dealing with anti-gender movements, and also an analysis of gender in the COVID crisis. And then third, we have Emanuela Lombardo from Spain. She's a senior lecturer at the Complutense University in Madrid. She has also got a very broad research agenda focusing on gender equality policies and their intersections with other inequalities, particularly in the European Union and Spain. And she also works on political representation and populism. And in her long publication list, I want to particularly refer to her 2017 edited volume with Johanna Kantela on gender and the economic crisis in Europe. And her work with Alba Alonso about gender and the democratization processes in Spain. So it's wonderful to have you and hearing you speak about these topics. So without further ado, I pass on the word to Amber, Julia, and Naomi, who will be again moderating the discussion.
Okay, hi everyone. We're really happy to see you all here. I'm sorry if I sound a bit nervous. This is because I am, honestly. But let's just start. Neoliberalism is a very broad term, and we are all very well aware of this. And that's why we would want to ask the first question to kind of narrow it down. And we would like to ask Elzbieta about your work, and how do you understand neoliberalism, and how do you see the link between neoliberalism and anti-feminism?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for organizing this discussion and for having me here. And I would be talking mostly, I would like to talk mostly in the context of my research on anti-gender mobilizations. And I see in the audience at least a few people who are interested in that too, and whose work have been also an inspiration to me. So basically, I think about neoliberalism not only as economic force, but also cultural formation or socio-cultural formation. And in the book that we just finished with my colleague Agnieszka Graf from Warsaw University, which is called The Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Moment. It will be published by Routledge in August, I think. We propose to think about the connection between neoliberalism and anti-feminism or anti-gender movements, not only in terms of something that I've been writing about before, so that the precarization of living and working conditions and, for example, discrimination against specific minorities causes the type of inequality, but also sense of insecurity that might push people towards, for example, voting for right-wing populist parties. But we would like to, or I would like to propose a vision in which anti-genderism successfully presents itself as a response to neoliberalism. So they offer a critique of neoliberalism without often calling it really that, which is quite successful, especially if it is paired with the type of welfare chauvinist policy making that is proposed, especially visible in Poland and Hungary. But you can see this sort of move towards welfare chauvinism on the part of right-wing parties and extreme right-wing parties in Western Europe, at least since mid-90s. So this is not a new phenomenon, but it has been perfected. So just to make sure that I'm making myself clear, when I'm talking about and thinking about neoliberalism, I think in terms of the ways in which neoliberalism is not an economic regime only or governance regime, but it is cultural paradigm. A type of rationality which permeates all realms of social life and social strata. And this is following Brown, Cabanes and Illouz, Ong, for example, a lot of scholars who look at this core of neoliberalism, which is the economic rationality, permeates all spheres of human activity, which includes cultural production, practices of citizenship, intimacy, identity, and especially emotions. So profit maximization and efficiency has become unquestioned, value, overruling cooperation, solidarity, democratic politics, pursuit of justice, and so on. And in that sense, what has been observed by many scholars, especially Brown, for example, historically, this individualistic paradigm has been developing in close alliance with neoconservatism. So this is what Wendy Brown has called the American nightmare, right? And the emphasis on family responsibility and moralization of social inequalities made these neoliberal policies in countries such as US, but also UK, for example, appear inevitable and natural. And I think that Melinda Cooper has shown in her book that, the entire history of neoliberal transformation was made possible by this neoconservative ethos of self-sufficiency, responsibility, the return of care work to the home. And within this paradigm, the private space of the family and women's unpaid work, and also minorities' subjugation, economic and social, worked within, worked to absorb the social impact of cuts in health and childcare. And cuts in programs addressed to marginalized communities, working poor, and so on. So traditional values and traditional family model were in fact conscious reinvention of neoconservatives. project of reimagining the social world in a way that would fit the new form of capitalism. And in that sense, people like Hayek imagined this as a way to counteract the intrinsic nihilism and moral degradation that comes with consumerism. But the relation between neoliberalism and anti-feminism looks differently now, especially if you look at Central Eastern Europe. And it is true that the neoliberal revolution in the region, the dismantling of social welfare state with job security, state support for families, took place and influenced the process of the transformation in the 90s and 2000s. But today, right-wing populists such as Law and Justice, for example, in Poland, or Fidesz in Hungary, they promote retraditionalization and anti-gender campaigns, but they increase the minimum wage, for example, profoundly increase the social spending on family-oriented policies. So rather than accepting the function of, promoters of family values in a neoliberal state, they position themselves as experts in social policy, in what is to become an ultra-conservative welfare state. And they gain this resonance by introducing a host of social policies targeted at traditional families, by critiquing this neoliberal ethos of individualism and effectiveness. And of course, if you look at the language and what they are promoting, there are many differences between, what we call neoliberalism and what they call neoliberalism, because when we talk about neoliberalism, they usually would be talking about rampant individualism or consumerism. What feminists call the crisis of care, the right redefines as the crisis of the family. And the demographic trends which feminists call, for example, reproductive strike, appear in this on the right-wing side as culture of death or abortion as genocide. But at the same time, they are really successful in creating this sense of opposing neoliberalism by presenting the world of capitalism winners as, degenerate, morally corrupt, as an emotional wasteland destroyed by the greed and consumption. And in that sense, feminism and progressive movements are very much accused of being the promoters of this notion, of this new trend. And this is actually a very interesting, there is actually a very interesting convergence between the feminist critiques of neoliberal feminism and the right-wing critiques of neoliberalism as feminism. Just to wrap up this, I think that this has profound consequences for the ways in which anti-genderism and right-wing populism operates as a force that is able to mobilize large portions of populations, but also it has profound consequences for us, because I think that progressive movements often act on feminism as if we are as if we own still the critique of neoliberalism. And what I'm saying is this is no longer the case, and we have to find new ways of thinking and speaking about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Elzbieta. I think you put a lot of wonderful topics out there for us to dive in. After we have other questions for Akwugo and Emanuela, just to clarify to you, the audience, you're very welcome to ask questions as well, either by raising your hand or by posting it in the chat. Then we can take them up. And otherwise, we have hopefully some room at the end of the seminar as well to address any remaining questions. Our second question goes to Emanuela, and it is the following. How has the erosion of the welfare state impacted gender equality and gender policies? And in what ways have right-wing or conservative actors exploited this?
Thank you so much for this debate. And I think I will try to respond to this from the context that I know a little bit about it, which is the Spanish context in relation to more Europeanization dynamics. And I mean, in the Spain's post-crisis context, there was a joint action of the European Union, in particular in the Eurozone countries, and then the central government in Spain, in terms of promoting austerity politics after the 2008 financial and economic crisis. And this in Spain pushed towards a more neoliberal gender regime at the central governmental level. Well, we have then analyzed this with Alba Alonso, finding that there were also contestations of this more neoliberal gender regime from other governmental levels, with more left-wing or coalition political ideologies. But there was this shift. For sure, and so this is clear in the fact that there was an increase in women's unemployment. There was worsening of working conditions for women and the rise in poverty. There was a substantial decrease in the governmental budget dedicated to gender equality policies. So, for example, Alba Alonso and Natalia Paleo have calculated that in Spain from 2009 to 2013, there was like minus 34% of cut at the central level, of cut to gender equality policies, and the dismantlement of gender equality policies and institutions. So this was done in particular by the conservative central government from the Popular Party, which gave a gendered, classed and racialized austerity policy response that had also consequences in terms of age and disability. Because if we look at the coordinated action of the European Union with national reform and stability programs for the Eurozone countries and the intervention of the Spanish conservative central government, then you see that there were cuts to the whole public budget and welfare policies, but also, for example, attacks to the universality of the public health system by excluding foreigners without a regular residence permit from the national health services, except for urgent cases. So the response was also very much already from the conservative parties, was also going towards gendered and racialized dynamics. So I think we also need to look at this kind of continuity. And there were budget cuts in the dependency law, which reduced financial state support to people caring for elderly, dependent, disabled relatives. So this again increased the strain on women carers and domestic migrant in carers often. So in this respect, the EU and Spain neoliberal politics after 2008 economic crisis had negative impacts on Spanish gender equality policies and the gender regime. And another thing that I'd like to say, because I think it helps to understand what's the context then in which these anti-gender actors intervene, is that neoliberal austerity politics also involves a process of de-democratization in different countries, but I speak from the Spanish context. So there was this construction of an emergency situation to face the economic crisis in Europe that moved the Spanish government to take decisions that can be considered authoritarian shifts. And these decisions were first taken by a socialist government that had advanced very much the whole agenda on gender equality policy and social policy and civil rights. But this government was asked by the European Central Bank to make an agenda of imperative reforms, which led this government to change the constitution in the middle of August through an emergency procedure with little parliamentary debates. So this already sort of establishes a kind of precedent that needs to be considered in terms of this de-democratization. Then there was the power was taken in Spain from 2011 by the conservative government, which intervene more strongly to control the contestation that was coming from civil society, the contestation of the austerity measures. And so it even adopted a law that was then renamed by civil society as the gag law, because this restricted the freedom of expression, participation, and other human rights. This was then revoked by the current governments, but still, you know, this is a law that was put there to also control this contestation from civil society, anti-austerity, and which had direct gender impacts on the feminist movement, that the autonomous feminist movement in Spain that was very mobilized at the time. So this as a context, and then you asked in what ways has right-wing conservative actors exploited this. I mean, in Spain now we have, well, this had an impact in different ways. The whole party system was changed in Spain. We now have parties to the right and to the left of the classical parties, and we now have a far-right party, Vox, from 2018, which has an ethno-nationalist and racist and anti-feminist positions, and this party has developed. I mean, it's not in government. It is now in Andalusia, for example. It is in the region of Andalusia. It has made agreement with the other two right-wing parties, but it already is determining changes in terms of backsliding of gender equality policies and of democracy. And there is a work by Alba Alonso and Julia Espinosa on Vox in particular, and its backsliding in gender equality policies, which shows that they have managed to really produce a backsliding in gender equality policies, even by being outside of the government, which shows that they are exploiting the continuities of the conservative and right-wing parties there. And of course, you know, they are radicalizing some elements of a discourse that was already there, and they introduce new elements as well. You know, they make it more. They have their own agenda, but they radicalize some of the elements that were also present in this intervention, and that this context of neoliberal emergency and de-democratization sort of favored, like it created a fertile ground for this. But of course, you know, the consequences, for example, in Andalusia are, you know, they show that they have cut, again, gender equality policies. They have created a regional ministry for family. They have defunded feminist organizations. And so they have also restructured the whole network of organizations by defunding feminist ones and funding organizations that are pro-life and more anti-gender, which are closer to their own agenda. So they have had an effect, certainly.
Thank you, Emanuela. It's really interesting to kind of explore how new actors like neoliberal feminists and right-wing populists claim this gender expertise. And I would like to go back into the restrictions on civil society, and you, Akwugo, have been working on that. So my question is, how do the funding cuts, but also the emergence of like neoliberal governmentality change the interaction between the state and civil society, NGOs, and who gets marginalized, first of all, and who gets to decide which feminist movements get to decide or become part of the state in shaping a gender equality state?
Well, thanks you guys for the invitation to speak. This has been so interesting so far. It's like being at ECPG, but without having to go anywhere. So it's really weird to be here. Anyway, so before I get started, I want to say a couple of things. So when I think about neoliberalism, I think about it, yes, as kind of an economic expression and a cultural formation, but really it's an ideology, right? It's the desire to privatize public life. And so we think about, is it Nancy Fraser, is it Michael Sandel, who says, can society be commodities all the way down, right? And I think it's best to keep it simple and straightforward, because then you kind of understand what you're fighting against, but also who the enemy is, which I think is actually important. And I guess also I would say, before the event started, kind of Amber was telling me what my question was going to be, and she was like, I think we're going to talk about governmentality. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's so old school. I haven't thought about governmentality in so long. It's so 2000s kind of thing. And I guess it's interesting because I don't know if I've thought about neoliberalism in this way, because I guess for the people that I'm kind of in conversation with, mostly we've kind of moved on to talk more about racial capitalism. And I actually do think that's important. And it's a missing element to some of the conversations that we've been having so far, because I think you can't understand this turn to either de-democratization, anti-genderism, anti-feminism, without also understanding that this is, the handmaiden is xenophobia of racism and white supremacy. So, and part of how kind of anti-genderism kind of makes its play is by kind of injecting kind of the insecurity of neoliberalism, but then projecting that onto kind of migrants, the other, the non-white, all the rest of it. So I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of those dynamics, that whatever is being wrought against kind of maybe once secure white women within these particular states, that is done on the backs of migrants, either at the border, drowning in the Mediterranean, or who are kind of the undercover class who are kind of cleaning offices or cleaning people's homes or looking after their children. So I think it's really important that we kind of bear that in mind. But in terms of what this means, in terms of kind of civil society's relationships to a neoliberal state or a racial capitalist state, I think you guys probably know a lot of this. I mean, in the work that Leah and I did a couple of years ago, which predates the COVID crisis, which I hope we all will kind of move on to talk about, is that what you see is especially in the British context, but also in the French context and the Dutch context, the privatization of the state is a long-running process from the 1990s. And what we see is a slow contracting out of kind of essential welfare state services. Where you have a voluntary sector or civil society organizations who may have once provided services as a supplement to the state, now become kind of contractors of the state to provide essential services. And so what Leah and I found in some of our work was that this kind of the contracting out of the state of various services, whether that's kind of youth work, care work, you name it, what we see is this sparks kind of what we call isometric kind of transformations. And so what it means is civil society organizations that might have put a lot of effort into advocacy work, lobbying work, all the rest of it, started to kind of transform their mode and function and organization in order to make themselves more attractive to receive contracts from the state. And then what that does then is create all kinds of competition between organizations who, let's not pretend that the voluntary sector is without conflict and without problems, but uncomfortable allies became competitors for funding, because at the same time, government block grants were cut as well. And so what we see is this fracturing of trust and solidarity amongst different kinds of civil society actors. And kind of those kind of more informal actors who maybe would never have thought about becoming a formalized organization because they were so starved of funding, found themselves being forced to kind of formalize, have a board of directors, get a secretary, and someone taking the minutes, all the rest of it, just so they could bid for contracts, so they could stay alive and look after kind of their particular community groups. And so that's caused all kinds of problems. And of course, these organizations, and this was never a sustainable model. And now in the context of COVID, where these already existing processes of cuts via austerity have been sped up, we now have the situation of a number of civil society organizations are closing because there's no money for anything. You know, we have local authorities here in England who are going bankrupt or on the verge of bankruptcy. So if like literally if the local authority can't stay in business, you know, never mind that, you know, smaller, more fragile voluntary sector organizations are also kind of are in tough times as well. I mean, and I don't want to speak as long as other people because I think we want to have a kind of conversation, but I'll just say that in terms of kind of what activists are doing, I mean, and, you know, I think most people know that my focus is on looking at what women of color activists are doing in a number of different European countries. I'm not sure that what they're doing has changed all that much, right? Because because these activists and kind of the groups that for whom they're working with and for and on behalf of, they've had their backs against the wall this whole time, right? So I think one of the things I used to say right when we were in the midst of the worst of austerity was that this is nothing new for women of color, right? So this idea of being contracted out, of kind of this deep economic insecurity, this was already the case. And the issue, what's new here is that now new groups are now experiencing the kind of precarity that women of color have always experienced. So in terms of activists, I'm not sure what they're doing is particularly different, but I think there is certainly a sense of urgency and people are feeling frantic. And also people are absolutely feeling the effects of, we have kind of a decade of cuts. Now we have a year of the COVID crisis, and what we see is now kind of this mental health crisis amongst activists who are exhausted, who have been going at full pelt for what, 12 years, 13 years. And so what we're seeing now are people kind of leaving the scene because they just cannot keep up this level of emergency that austerity, neoliberalism, and now the COVID crisis has presented.
Thank you. That's really interesting what you said about the work of activists not really changing. And I was wondering whether this is also true for other contexts, because, well, I kind of want to go back to what Elzbieta, you said about the populist right becoming the new actors of welfare and new providers of welfare. And I couldn't help but wonder whether this has actually changed the feminist movements and activist work in Poland. So maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
It's really fascinating to compare different contexts, because exactly the process that you've described, Akwugo, has been something that we talked about so much in the 90s and the beginning of 2000s. The process of NGOization, the ways in which foreign funding has channeled feminist movements in the region especially, but also in other parts of the world, sort of developing world, support, along with this type of transnational policy. That was actually something that was happening quite a lot, and this kind of the tendency to move towards service provision, because that was something that has been transferred towards civil society organizations, sort of outside of the state. And actually what we witness now in Poland during the last couple of years is, on the one hand, organizations which actually focus on support, for example, for battered women, or shelters, providing shelters for LGBT people, or providing support for people who are a migrant or asylum seekers. This is something, these are the three main areas where the state just withdrew all the money from. So there is a huge work on the one hand in trying to find different sources of funding, trying to mobilize people also on this kind of transnational arena and so on. But on the other hand, there is trend towards mass mobilization, the type that we have seen in Poland, where on the 20th of October last year, despite the COVID restrictions, we had the biggest public mobilization since the Solidarity times, since 1989. 400,000 people on the streets of over 600,000 villages all over Poland, protesting the horrible law that would actually implement a blanket ban on abortions, because we had a ban before, but that was a total shutdown on the possibility to get an abortion in a public hospital. And there is a tendency for especially young people to mobilize without investing into this process of institutionalization, or with a limited tendency for formalization, but looking, for example, for the ways in which online networking can become sort of a substitute for formal institutions in the sphere of civil society, or looking for different kinds of new forms of activism, such as Akcja Demokracja, Action Democracy, progressive organization that I've been on the board of, where the idea is to mobilize people on the ground for the petition drives and be totally independent from the state. So not look for grants and build it in the model, but rather focus on small donations from activists. So I see that there's a lot of things going on in these areas, and there is a shift in the ways in which people think about institutionalization and NGOization during the last couple of years, and there is a real attempt to find other ways. But of course, it doesn't. It goes in a way in line with the changes in social policies, because if you think about, for example, direct cash transfers for families with children, they had, in my humble opinion, we could use this money much better by investing in public services, but still it had an impact on reducing the number of children who, for example, are economically disadvantaged. So in that sense, there were some cuts in specific areas, but on the other hand, you had huge investment on the part of the state in social policy and social spending. So this is a very ambiguous picture in that respect, and it will be really interesting to analyze, what's happening in different contexts.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, just so people are clear about what I mean, that, so I'm not disagreeing with anything, but I just want to clarify. So when I say that, I'm not sure activists are doing anything particularly differently, what I mean is, of course, it's a year on from the large mobilizations in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests in response to George Floyd's murder that we saw across Europe, all those big solidarity protests, and as an opportunity then to, especially for kind of Afro-feminist activists, to spotlight the localized deaths in custody, as well as kind of deaths in the Mediterranean. And I think, and it's different from the Poland case, that I don't think we should conflate these spectacular protests with, or demonstrations with kind of the everyday on the ground kind of activism. Because I think, the everyday kind of self-help, mutual aid societies, all the rest of it are things that have a long history that were done in response to austerity, but then now also takes on a greater urgency in response to kind of the COVID crisis. And so, but I don't want to dismiss those big protests. But of course, so Leah and I have another project, Women of Color Resist, which is finally finished as a result of COVID. It's finally done, and so things will be out. You will be reading things shortly. But we were surprised by kind of what the activists are telling us that they're doing is not necessarily all that different from what we found for our project on, on kind of the early days of anti-austerity. So I just want to be clear about that. I don't want to dismiss at all these mass mobilizations.
If nobody else wants to react, I have another question for you, Akwugo. I want to go back to the point that you made about deep economic insecurity being nothing new for women of color, which clearly, of course, points out the dominance of white feminism in Europe. And I wanted to ask why institutions and movements struggle to employ an intersectional feminism, and how alliances can be formed without co-opting or diminishing the space of movements such as Black feminism, LGBTQ activism, and other groups?
Well, Naomi, this is $1 million question. How, what can we do? I don't, so trying to understand the failure of solidarity between white women and various women of color across Europe has been like the stalking horse of my research. So even though that's not something I'm particularly I don't care, to be honest, but it's something that always comes up. And and has not changed in the kind of 15 years I've been doing this, this kind of various iterations of this project on what women of color do in response to austerity. No one has found the secret ingredient. There have been some interesting alliances. Oftentimes the tensions are lessened around basic welfare advocacy and reform. So people coming together in a local neighborhood to defend their community center, to defend a very specific service. It's a service that everyone uses and everyone is mobilizing their identity as a mother or carer or whatever. And that seems to reduce a lot of the friction or tension between activists. But in terms of looking more broadly, especially and then drawing specifically on this project that just finished, you know, whether it was in Spain or Germany or Denmark or anywhere else, all the women of color activists we spoke with said, whilst they have witnessed some changes amongst their kind of revolutionary white sisters, what they have found is it's too slow, requires too much convincing. Well, first of all, hand-holding, that you know, people have to be, their comrades have to be reassured by that they're not racist, and you know, and they have to deal with kind of people crying all the time and all the rest of it. And I don't think that there is a way around this, because especially on the continent, because racism, white supremacy is not something that people are comfortable talking about, but also even kind of the revolutionary left is not comfortable talking about these things. This will be an ongoing barrier, and it's even worse in the kind of feminist sector because you know, feminists think that they are fine. So anyway, so I don't know. I mean, this is $1 million question of what to be done. These activists don't know, and the response is actually not to work with white women anymore. And that's one response, and I think it's a totally logical response. But I don't know. You tell me.
Emanuela, please go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to say something, but this is not, you know, I'm not an expert on this, but I just wanted to call our attention on an article that I recently read that I really liked. This article by Rosella Chichan and Connie Rogeband on intersectional coalitions. And I think, I mean, the article points more towards a normative ideal of what intersectional coalition could be, and more going towards this recognition of differences, and so you know, coalitions can be more transformative if they manage to include, to be more representative, but also to materially redistribute resources among the more marginalized people within the coalition, and not try to reappropriate the discourse of the more marginalized within the coalition. And so these could open up for possibility for more durable coalitions, which of course take longer, as Akwugo was saying before. But I think it would really be great to see more research, more empirical studies to identify what are the possibilities, what are the you know, what are the factors that can promote these kind of intersectional coalitions, because we know there are territorial dynamics and all sorts of privileges that generate these that make this difficult. But I think it's also important that we try to look for what are the political opportunities for doing intersectional politics. And also, if I look at the more institutional sphere, the opportunities for doing more intersectional politics are open up for, if I look at the Spanish case, for example, when actors with more left political ideology and with some experience and some knowledge about intersectional feminism entered the institutions. And this happened at the local level, for example, in the municipality of Barcelona after 2015 with civic platforms that were created for the elections. And so there were actors from civil society that had worked in struggles about class inequalities, about gender inequalities, and who entered then the institutions. And so we saw some policies that were different. We saw the creation of more intersectional institutions. So I think also the political opportunities are important in this respect, and the creation of these channels for actors from civil society with this kind of knowledge and experience to enter the institutions. So this can also help to bring change. But I do not deny that this is challenging, and so I agree with what Akwugo was saying before.
Can I just very briefly say, because I know I gave a very cynical response, and I'm also kind of, because there's no good answer. And I'm not disagreeing with what Emma is saying, because I think it's always good to be optimistic. I think we should strive for these things. But as someone who actually does this empirical work to see literally on the ground, so, Connie's paper is great, but it's an ideal type. But when you actually speak to the activists themselves who are trying to work in coalition, what you see time and time again is that kind of the women of color activists feel as if their white comrades don't trust them, don't believe that they have the knowledge, skills, and experience to lead, to set the agenda, to set tactics, to set strategy, and talk over them and keep leadership positions and any kind of real power within these networks and organizations. They hoard that power for themselves. And so whether you're looking at kind of migrants' rights groups, LGBT groups, you name it, where you see where you would think and hope and pray that you would see people's first response would be to an expression of intersectional solidarity. What we find time and again, so this is a 6-country study, looking at several hundred people. People have not been able to do that. There have been these small moments, and mostly around very tangible material resources have been these small victories. So I guess I would kind of caution us and really kind of ask ourselves what's going on with the ways in which, especially continental Europeans, express intersectionality in such a way that the actual women of color on the ground doing this work still find themselves at the margins and feel as if their only response is actually to withdraw from these spaces.
Yes, Elzbieta, please go on. I was actually asking.
Yeah, may I add to that, because I think that what we often talk about values, but we don't talk about procedures and the ways in which organizational structures within, for example, coalition building, enable this kind of inequalities and this kind of taking the voice out of some of the actors. And in that sense, I think that this is something that that is missing when I look at the Polish women's movement. It is also missing, in terms of who is getting to speak. How do we create structures and procedures that would really enable, everyone to be able to have impact on decision-making process, for example, in the coalition, in the broad coalition, right? And this is something that we seldom discuss, because we often sort of, meaning I'm thinking activist, because I'm also an activist, so it's sort of a double identity for me, that we talk about, our benevolence, our goodwill, but we don't talk about how do we actually make it work in our organizations, in the coalitions that we are building, in the process of for example, creating groups and coalitions that would try to impact policymaking or decision makers. So this is something that I'm missing from these discussions a lot, that we don't talk about the practicalities of doing intersectionality. and we talk about the fact that we want to do it, that we appreciate it, that this is something that we value so much. But then when it comes to decision making, it turns out that it's very often hierarchy oriented, that it's very much leader oriented, that those who have power will retain power. And unfortunately, because there is scarcity of resources, there is much more infighting, there are quite big conflicts around who will be the sort of the face, or who will get the access to specific types of resources, since there is so little of them. And the answer is usually, if we don't do it together, nobody will actually get the real access to the real resources which matter in our everyday life. So this is something that I'd really like us to talk about and sort of insert into this discussion.
Just to follow up, well, in the Polish context, do you think that it is possible to do intersectionality on the ground? Because with every other debate around what Law and Justice is doing, we see these topics that spring up that divide the movement, like in the recent women's movement about abortion. There was a big divide around trans rights and including the LGBT community in this movement. So do you think in practice, in the Polish context, doing intersectionality is something that can happen, or maybe are you also as skeptical as Akwugo?
I am both skeptical and optimistic, because I'm quite skeptical when I look at sort of my generation, because I see how we fail, basically, how we are not able to really make it happen in a good way. It's mostly around events, sort of, when there is something happening, we are all rushing down to support specific groups. But then it is often the case that we sort of withdraw in our usual ways of thinking and doing. But when I look at the younger generation, there are people who are, when I look at the climate strike, for example, or people who work with who join forces, and they think of themselves as both feminists, leftists, climate activists, and people who work for queer rights, right? So they don't have this division in their mind to begin with, right? And this is something that makes me hopeful. And this is the ways in which intersectionality should be happening in doing. But when I look at the ways in which it is, how difficult it is to embed it in existing structures, I feel again that we, and there are, like with the Polish women's strike, I think that it's a great organization, it's a great potential. There's thousands of people who would like to do something, but without clear structure of, decision making and real democratic procedures for inclusion, we won't make it happen. We won't be able to do that.
Thank you. I would actually like to go back to Emanuela, what you were talking about, institutionalization of feminist movements in Spain. And I was wondering about Podemos, because like under austerity, a left government kind of like introduced really big cuts, but at the same time, we had all these social movements that erupted, and with that, Podemos. In what ways do you think Podemos can institutionalize feminism, and how do they interact with feminist movements? And most importantly, do they have an intersectional lens?
Thank you so much. Well, so Podemos in Spain, we know it emerged in 2014. So it was it came out of this movement from the indignados. No, how we know it in Spain. We call it the 15th of May, 2011, but it's more well known as the indignados movement. No. So indeed, Podemos represented or claimed to represent the struggle for more democracy, against political corruption, against austerity politics, so more going towards the left. And And it must be said that both at the local level and now at in the central government coalition, left coalition, it has brought about changes in this direction. So like at the local level, after these subnational elections in 2015, we saw the emergence of these civic platforms that were formed both by United Podemos and then members from these civil societies, activists that had been involved, for example, in these house eviction, in contrasting the house evictions, or members of the feminist movement, LGBT movement. So some of these people entered the institutional politics. And at the local level, so we saw, and regional level as well. So we saw, like in Barcelona and in Madrid, we had mayors who were from left wing, or in Barcelona directly from civil society. So in terms of looking for possibilities, it catalyzed the possibility to create this channel of representing some of the claims from civil society to enter formal politics. So there was some openings in this direction. And for example, as I was saying before, like towards intersectionality in Barcelona, we had there was the creation of an institution that was called Feminism, LGBT and Life Cycle. So trying to treat together for the first times gender and sexuality issues and issues about more care and the life cycle. So there were some entering possibilities for this. And also, if we look at this central government coalition from the left that now sees socialists and Podemos in government, it must be said that there was progress in gender equality policies, and to some extent also in addressing issues of gender and sexuality together, and issues of class. I would say less issues of race inequalities in part, but I think this definitely has a lot of room for improvement, both at the central and at the local level. So there were channels in this respect, and openings, but also, we wrote an article with Joanna Cantula some years ago about feminist politics in Podemos, and analyzing left-wing populism and right-wing populism, looking at the Finns in Finland. And yes, indeed we found that this less populist party like Podemos were promoting more feminist politics in terms of women's representation, in terms of representing some substantive claims in gender equality, and creating space for having feminist groups. But we also found that there was the same gender informal norms that exist in all political parties that we know from the gender and politics literature were reproduced also in Podemos. And so we found the ethos of hegemonic masculinity. We found these aggressive kind of dynamics, antagonistic dynamics that do not promote a more cooperative, more horizontal, more participatory approaches that feminist politics advocates. So there are problems in that respect. Of course, it's not. I mean, there are maybe there are some possibilities now, because the male leader of the party has now left the party, and after the last regional elections in Madrid, and so now there's two women who have a more prominent position in the party, so and who are now minister in the central government, and who are have more, in particular, I think more intersection with class issues. And so let's see if this feminization becomes also more depatriarchalization in terms of the politics, we'll see what happens.
Thank you. I actually just saw that we also have a question in the chat. It is for Akwugo. It's about the inability to engage with the racial dimensions of the current and past neoliberalism, and how we talk about race and gender, and specifically intersectionality, whether that plays a role, and whether intersectionality is a useful term or metaphor in a European context, or if it just contributes to a general sense of unease with talking about racism and racial neoliberalism. I hope it makes sense.
It does. It does.
Okay,
My
perfect.
former colleague who was at Warwick, and Marianne, you're at where she's up north. She's St. Andrews now, I think. Got a job. I'm so happy for you. Anyway, it's good to see you. Well, I don't know if I'm actually the person to be answering this question, because for the work that I do and the scholars that I'm in conversation with, I think, as I indicated, of course, neoliberalism is important, but perhaps the better accounting of this moment is really trying to take seriously Cedric Robinson's idea of racial capitalism. And I think part of the reason why these conversations cannot be heard is because of the long-standing critique of the ways in which intersectionality has been co-opted, emptied of race. There is no kind of lexicon in the continental European context to talk seriously about race and racism. People don't want to be implicated themselves, but this is the long shadow of fascism that one of the greatest legacies of European fascism is not being able to talk about race in any kind of meaningful way in the contemporary moment, which is, for me, absolutely fascinating. Kind of seems to be learning all the wrong lessons of this dark period. So for me, I don't know if because I know that I'm doing this work. I think that this is a question for kind of other scholars to say, what's stopping you, from kind of taking this seriously? Because, to be honest, the culture wars that we're seeing across the continent, right? So kind of Macron's, attack on intersectionality, the renewed attacks on kind of women with headscarves, all these kinds of things follow the same pattern. And if we only look at this through a frame of class and gender, you're kind of missing the whole story here. And it's not either one of these things, it's both and, alongside issues of race and thinking about processes of othering, and really taking seriously how these border disputes are being leveraged in very particular ways to rob everyone of their rights and to rob everyone of their security. But until that's a lesson that needs to be kind of better learned. But I don't think people are willing to necessarily do that, because when I'm speaking to the activists who are kind of in these kind of interactions, there is such a fear of being called a racist and being labeled as excluding and exclusive and all the rest of it, that it really kind of stymies more kind of honest conversations to be had. So I mean, I agree. I'm just, what can I say? This is something anyone who knows me knows. I've literally been saying this for as long as I've ever been interacting with all of you. So this is kind of old news kind of thing. So.
Okay, I think we're slowly running out of time, but maybe someone from the audience has any questions for our speakers. I think this is the moment that we kind of open up the floor to you and give you an opportunity to interact and to ask some questions. So you can use the raise hand option in the under participants, or just post your questions in the chat. So I see in the chat we have a question asking the other speakers to follow up on what Akwugo was talking about now, about whether intersectionality is the right term to use in the European context. So maybe we can hear from you now.
Well, clearly there are, regional differences and country differences, because in Poland, in countries such as Poland or Central Eastern Europe, this dynamic is very different because of the ways in which the society has been restructured after the Second World War. So, for example, in Poland, we would have, this is also the question how we treat what we think of as the matrix for discrimination or the matrix for hatred. In Poland, this matrix would be anti-Semitism, quite clearly. So you could see how, for example, anti-gay or anti-LGBTQ discourses are reaching out or using certain elements of anti-Semitic views, both in the Polish context and also, from the 30s in France and Germany. But I'm wondering if the problem that we have is, as long as we will be looking for the issue, the type of discrimination that sort of underlies it all, as long as we do that, we won't be able to see all of those elements of the matrix. So in that sense, for me, the more important question is how to think about intersectionality, not in terms of stable identities, but as something that is relational, because power is relational and power is being acted out between people, groups, nations, and so on. And there is always this hierarchy embedded in the ways in which this power relations work. And this is something that really bothers me when I look at the discussions, for example, around sex work or trans rights, right? That we don't see it really, that we really are embedded in this kind of thinking that, intersectionality is about identities and it's not about, social relations and power hierarchy in a more general sense. And this is really divisive. That's the way I say it. But I don't have a clear sense of, how to deal with that, how to make sure that we are seeing, the workings of power, no matter which context we are dealing with and what kind of social characteristics are the most important for creating these hierarchies of power in this specific context. So, so this relational and approach is something that I would propose, but I'm not sure, how to convince others to sort of think that this might be an opportunity for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I think it calls for all scholars to address our own condition, our own positioning from which we speak, and the power and privileges that we all have, and the marginalization and denials that we also reproduce. And for sure, there is an issue, for example, in the Spanish context, about the denial of race inequalities. I can see it both in the academia, but also in the movement, for example, when there have been massive mobilizations of the feminist movement in Spain around the 8th of March. And it was, the struggles that put together students and consumption, issues of consumption and the climate care aspects. But then there were the criticisms from Afrofeminists, from the race equality feminist organization, criticizing that they were not included from the start in the organization of these huge feminist strikes. So I think that there is an issue about opening spaces in which then the privileges of people from the academia, from the movement, can be contested. So there's aspect about opening up more to what Akwugo was saying in terms of the epistemic justice and epistemic recognition of underprivileged groups, and then practicing it through opening spaces in which this can be the privileges can be contested. But yes, I mean, it is an issue of power indeed. I mean, it's not, the question was also about if it makes sense to still use the concept of intersectionality. I mean, I think it does make sense, but then we have to still work and to make it real in the practice of questioning power and privileges, which is of course a challenge.
So I'm not sure if we can still allow a question, but I saw a raised hand before. Sinem, if you just want to unmute.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you for this excellent webinar for us. That is interesting because I'm also just completed my postdoc research in the similar case. My research was about, it was in Nottingham University, and it was about transnational solidarity for the rights of migrant women. And it was I had a field research in UK and in Turkey. And what I've observed, maybe I can also add to Akwugo in some sense, because just what I've listened from her is what I also observed in the field studies, that specifically in UK, the women movement is really dispersed, and organizations are really dispersed, and they set tactical agendas and in order to get the fundings. And the funding mechanism is really important. Also, as well as in Turkey, even though the Turkish women movement is really strong, since the refugees entered, I questioned whether they have a sort of solidarity between these groups, you know, the Turkish women movement and whether these refugee women. And I realized they really do not care these women's rights. So I realized they only do projects if EU fundings prioritize refugee women title in the project's funding. They only, you know, do something for these women. So I realized that funding mechanism also deteriorates this solidarity, and there is a need to question the political economy of women solidarity, that we need to look from this point as well. And what I know from specifically from Turkish case, that what I know that in the 1980s, there was no such fundings or even organizing. There's informal loose groups that were together, and more vocal and more solidarity was really much more intense. But since the organizations started and NGOization is, you know, started to expand, and this funding mechanism started, it cuts also the solidarity. I think the question also is, or the solidarity or intersectional feminism should also be considered from, as well as from this point, what I think and what I observed from my PhD and postdoc research. What would you think, what the presenters will think about it, about this funding mechanism? Because there's really a compete between women organizations, you know, and I was really surprised when I observed in Turkey, because in Turkey, we haven't had this sort of a history, you know. The women movement is really very strong indeed. Would you, even including UK, what do you think the presenters will say about it? Thank you.
Well, will I go ahead and, okay, I'll start. So yeah, that was kind of one of the main findings of the project that Leah, Basil, and I did called Minority Women in Tough Times. And this continues. And I guess for me, especially speaking specifically for the UK context, what's been very interesting is to see how the erosion of trust and solidarity, how that's taking place specifically within the women's sector of the voluntary sector. It's been very interesting to see how and map kind of the ruthlessness with which kind of larger kind of organizations, especially those kind of especially in the anti-violence against women sector in particular. So the kind of larger organizations that may well run kind of women's refuges and may well provide kind of welfare advice and support started because their block grant from local government had been cut. Started bidding for contracts, but then they bid for contracts for everything. And what we found is specifically in the UK context were that kind of smaller, more fragile, women of color led anti-violence against women's projects were actually going under, were actually, because they lost their funding in competition to these wider, larger organizations mostly run by white women who don't have kind of any kind of specialist knowledge and skills to work with either migrant women, refugee women, or other women of color. And so that's something that we're still now unstitching. I'm on the board of a philanthropy, of a large philanthropy, and they have finally realized what's happening. And so they're trying to kind of help to try to unstitch some of this in terms of saying, how can we actually re-inject, kind of rebuild what was once lost in terms of kind of specialist services, especially around anti-violence against women. So that's, the tide is slowly starting to turn, but there's no money for anything. And so a lot of these services that, especially these specialist services for women of color and Muslim women, have collapsed, and most likely they won't come back anytime soon. So it's actually kind of dire straits. So it's very interesting how this is something that's played out across the non-governmental sector, but it's been especially vicious specifically within the women's sector, which is a great irony, but I think says a lot about things.
Yes, if I can also say something from the, I don't know if you wanted also to know something from the Spanish case. I think there is what we see in particular in the region of Andalusia, where I was saying to you before that Vox is now, has agreement with the two other right-wing parties of that are in government, is that we see this selective access to public funding. So there is a reorientation of the public funding away from the women's rights organizations and towards more anti-gender pro-life organizations. So this is taking place there already. So there is a restructuring of this whole network to basically eliminate the more critical feminist organization and then give more funding to the ones that support the anti-gender visions of the party. But it must be said, and I'd like to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, that we saw this tendency also in the classic conservative party in different regions and municipalities in Spain, which already in the period of the economic crisis were taking away funding from feminist organizations and giving it to pro-life organizations and giving public funding only for women in difficult economic situations, only if they wanted to continue their pregnancies and not if they wanted to stop their pregnancies, for example. So there are some continuities in this respect. That then we see they become more extreme now with in regions like Andalusia, where there is the far right party has in agreement with the other right wing parties. So now what Alba Alonso and Julia Espinosa show in the paper that I was mentioning to you is that in fact they are attacking directly this feminist organization, and the first action that they did when the regional government started working was to eliminate the funding of these women's organizations. And so this is a very clear vision of giving the funding to the more anti-gender pro-life organization rather than to the feminist ones. So I think it's important that civil society stays alert and that this is denounced, that this is brought to knowledge about everybody, and that also that more people who want to work for equality that act in a more proactive way to continue bringing on a vision and agenda that is not just reactive towards what all these anti-gender groups are doing, but also that put forward a more social democratic or feminist and vision for society.
Thank you, Emanuela. I don't know if Elzbieta, you also just quickly want to react. We're already a bit over time.
Yeah, I can just quickly say that the Polish state is doing what Emanuela has described as the national policy in Spain. So restructuring of public funding to civil society organizations, changing the profile of civil society organizations, getting the funding, creating new organizations, which are very conservative, gender conservative, patriotic, nationalist, what's not, and which are getting, substantial funding also for, offices, not only within the grant system, because there has been a new program to support civil society also in terms of infrastructure, so that civil society organization will be able to build strong organizations, and this money is going to those who are in line with the politics of the right-wing populist government. So what they are doing is to restructure the whole system of civil society state relations, channeling the money, and actually creating a new civil society elites that would be cooperating closely with the government.
So I think I have the privilege to close this session by thanking you so much, because I think it's been really very interesting and inspiring discussion. And I thank you so much, Akwugo and Elzbieta, Emanuela, for sharing these great insights and showing us your knowledge and the different contexts that we've been seeing. And I think it allows for much more. So it's been too short. Also, thank you very much, Amber, Julia, Naomi, for moderating. I think you did a great job and great questions. And also thank you, the public, for your questions and being here present. So, well, it was very nice. And I hope we have other occasions to continue the conversation, I'm sure. And I wish you all a very great day. And again, thank you.